Okay, I think we'll begin. So, welcome everyone to the 85th meeting of the Myling Group. My name's John Davis and I am Director. Can I say before we get the proceedings started, a very big thank you as always to our friends at Hewlett-Packard who are en masse tonight actually. I think one in every about 2 or 3 is probably here tonight. I can't imagine why. Also, we got to thank the Impact QM initiative as well at Queen Mary on the science and computer side. So this is also the second of our MEG Tech talks. The first one when we had Ben Hammersley, the Prime Minister's ambassador to East London Tech City here. Uniquely, I've been at every one of the Myling groups. And I always think that they fall basically, you know, there's like a spectrum between those that are more entertaining and those that are more educational. This one I think probably falls into both camps. Certainly I hope so. And what I'd like to do now is to welcome our very special guests. Sir Kevin Tebbit, Visiting Professor at Queen Mary, and Sir David Omand, both former directors of GCHQ, to talk about cyber security. David will talk for 20 minutes, Kevin will follow up with 10, then we'll have plenty of questions, I hope, from the audience, and we will all be out of here for a reception at 7:45. For those of the Twitterati here, our hashtag is MEG85, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce Sir David. Thank you for coming.
Well, good evening, everyone. I want to talk about cyber security strategy in the context of national security policy. And Kevin is going to talk about the response from business and from the industry. First of all, the threat. Is there anyone in the hall who would have the nerve to put up their hands and say they would challenge the judgment of the coalition government to make cyber security one of the top 4 concerns in the national security strategy? I see no hands. Last week we heard publicly from Jonathan Evans, Director General of the Security Service, that vulnerabilities in the internet are being exploited to what he called an astonishing extent for aggressive, malicious activity, not just by criminals, but by states. Now, I imagine it takes quite a lot to astonish a hardened Director General of MI5. Using his words again, we are being subject to industrial scale processes, interesting point, involving many thousands of people lying behind both state-sponsored cyber espionage and organized cyber crime. But I think there's a deeper point I want to start with. What is at stake here, I think, is not just government secrets and the effectiveness of our armed forces, serious as those issues are, or indeed the safety and security of our national infrastructure, particularly as we move into the Internet of Things, where cars, refrigerators, and smart meters are all hooked up to the Internet, connecting 2 billion people and 6 billion things. Numbers I expect to grow exponentially. No, the point I want to emphasize at the outset is safeguarding the intellectual property upon which our future return to prosperity will depend, and indeed safeguarding confidence in the security of the internet for personal and commercial business. It's a difficult issue to quantify, but I think it's hugely important for future national prosperity and economic growth, and to reap the social benefits from the digital future, and that is confidence in the cyber realm. So, point 1, I think the government was quite right to start its strategy by saying the purpose of cyber security is to secure those gains. It's not a security activity for its own sake. I wish the science fiction writer and cyberpunk William Gibson had never coined the term cyberspace. He himself described it as an evocative but essentially meaningless buzzword. In recent evidence to a select committee, I drew the analogy with the development of the internal combustion engine to power horseless carriages. In its day, it was a dangerous innovation. It certainly had a dark side in giving criminals in motor cars the opportunity to rob a bank in one state and be across state lines within hours, and in giving hugely more destructive power to the military through the tank and the armored car. But the management of that risk was not in having a man with a red flag walking in front of each motor car, but in exploiting the massive economic impact of the motor car by a combination of encouraging personal responsibility with widely shared norms for what is safe driving, backed up with some regulation and some law, plus aligning incentives with industry, including the insurance industry, to encourage safer, more secure vehicles to be marketed. And of course, as we all know, the motor car became an engine of social change, not just in encouraging travel and mobility beyond the upper middle classes, but in compressing time from weeks to days or hours, and now the internet is doing the same, from hours to minutes and seconds, and indeed milliseconds. And our children's lives, as we all know, are going to be very different. Now, does that speeding up of life make us more vulnerable as a society? As things are now, I think you would have to admit, yes, it probably is. But The Economist newspaper is conducting an online debate at the moment as we sit here. And so far, the results from The Economist, it's still going on, are that just under 60% of respondents agree with the motion that a hyper-connected world is more rather than less secure, perhaps a surprising result. And the argument against is obviously that the more you entwine technology in our daily lives, the more security failures seem inevitable, often not from the technology itself, but from human weaknesses and errors, and a hyper-connected world will end up amplifying these failures. I think the stronger argument is that security in the new world we're entering will not just be about the technology itself, but how it enables us to be smarter. We are, therefore, I suggest, in a transitional era where we have to adjust our behaviors to manage those risks, rather like teaching country children to cross a road safely when it's full of motor cars, say, in 1920. Now, another point that's worth emphasizing, I think, is that the cyber revolution in this transitional age is driven by the private, not the public sector. The public sector will eventually catch up by enabling digital services for the public, but at the moment, the driver is in the private sector. And the Director General Security Services speech at Mansion House made very clear there are threats today we have to counter now, and there are potential threats for the future that we must begin to research and prepare for. As with my example of the internal combustion engine, I think if you looked at every technological innovation, from radio waves to microprocessors, there have turned out to be implications for national security. Cyber is therefore a wonderful case study in policymaking. It's a great big baggy monster of a subject. It covers everything from vandalism of websites at one end to activity equivalent to acts of armed aggression at the other, with lots of crime in between. And if we're thinking of the national security domain, I'm talking about that tonight rather than the crime, it helps to think not of cyber attack by hostile cyber warriors, but of ways of countering in current circumstances four familiar activities: espionage, the development by potential adversaries of improved weapon systems, sabotage, and subversion. Now, in the interest of time, I will pass over subversion, for example, countering extremist websites and uncovering hostile networks and all of that. But let me say something about the espionage dimension of this. in which I include theft of commercially valuable as well as security information. Espionage is, and we've had this debate at the Mile End group several times, ubiquitous. It can't be outlawed by international law, since, like the old arguments about terrorists and resistance movements and freedom fighters, nobody's ever going to agree on definitions. So states, intergovernmental organizations, NGOs, companies, and individuals, we're all going to have to take our own responsibility for protecting that which is most vulnerable and that which is most valuable to us. I wonder what will be the cyber equivalent for China of the mass expulsion by Alec Douglas Hume in 1971 of 105 Soviet diplomats and citizens from London. It didn't stop espionage on either side, but it sure delivered a strong message that the then level of Soviet espionage had reached an intolerable level. Now, one clue thinking about this was given by the present director of GCHQ, Ian Lobham, in his first public speech. He suggested that good cybersecurity based on professional technical advice from the industry can solve, say, 80% roughly of cybersecurity vulnerabilities. Basic network discipline, keeping your patches up to date, educating staff on good practice, good information assurance, good personnel security, and all the rest of it. But tackling the remaining 20% is complex and is going to involve active detection in what I would term the intelligence space. And that means using our own intelligence capabilities and working with our close allies to illuminate the capabilities of the attacker, even the intentions of the attacker, and to detect the exfiltration of information, or in the case of criminals, the exfiltration of our cash from our systems. And that then triggers law enforcement, and in future may give us some ways in which we can actively disrupt the attacker, or even in some circumstances strike back. To this end, down in Cheltenham, the CSOC, the Cyber Operations Center, Cybersecurity Operations Center, has been set up as a joint national asset, and it seems to be paying dividends. At the moment, we're in the phase, the more effective it gets, the more it uncovers. So don't be surprised when the number of cases goes up. I might, though, looking at this 80-20, draw an analogy with the conceptual security framework that we used during the Cold War to protect government and List X defense contractors from Soviet and Warsaw Pact espionage. The 80% of security you got through good personnel security practices, security vetting, classifying information, locking it up in cupboards, having bars on the windows and bolts on the doors, and all the rest of it. But the 20%, the really dangerous 20%, you could only get by intelligence work, uncovering the deep penetration agent, tracking the suspected espionage agents of the other side, uncovering and disrupting their activities. And if you hold that in your mind and then think, and I hope Kevin's going to be talking about this, how do we then reconcile two conflicting propositions? The first is we have to protect or ensure the protection of a very large number of companies and government organizations that use networks with information critical to our economic, financial, and everyday life. We have to protect them from cyber attack and to give our own armed forces the leverage that comes from cyber capability. The second consideration is that to do this for the 20%, the dangerous 20%, the advanced persistent threat, requires the leverage from the intelligence space, and that involves very highly classified information. And on the part of the companies, they're being prepared to share commercially extremely sensitive information with a near real-time response. And that requires levels of understanding, business awareness, partnership. I suspect the message here hasn't penetrated very far below the level of the large, technically savvy companies. But I know there's a lot going on from government to try and get the message over. We should also remember it's no longer just a question of securing the information that passes around our cyber networks. Essential there that is. Part of the revolution that I'm describing is that we've digitized our intellectual heritage. The musical score, the film, the book, the three-dimensional model of the new drug, the CAMCAD drawing for the fly-by-wire airliner, the medical records, the ledgers through which we account for our financial assets. God help us, the financial assets themselves are just a string of noughts and zeros held somewhere digitally and capable, therefore, of being stolen or corrupted. I think it follows that in the interests of public security in the future, we have to get used to the idea that we are going to have to empower our law enforcement and intelligence community to partner with the private sector and to operate as effectively in the digital world as they have, as it were, in the old analog world. We have a test case in front of us. The government's communications data bill proposals provide an excellent example of the case being made by government that without this enabling legislation, the police will simply be unable, as the years go by, to track the activities of serious criminals, terrorists, pedophiles, and the like in so-called cyberspace. And if that indeed is the case, then in parallel, we're going to need, as the public, to be reassured about the oversight of this activity, parliamentary and judicial, and the checks and balances necessary to prevent misuse of these investigative cyber powers. A quick word about the second of my category, weapons systems. I think I mentioned espionage. Modern cyber technologies provide ways of enhancing all forms of warfare, in the air, in space, on land, and at sea. The effects are pervasive, and the Ministry of Defense needs to look across all its domains to strengthen our defenses and to look to the offense, since we need the ability to enhance our capabilities, for example, suppressing enemy air defenses in combat by degrading their electronic systems. This is still this is work in progress. The truth is we can no more foresee where the early steps in the use of cyber in warfare will lead than, say, the young instrument maker James Watt in Glasgow could have foreseen in 1775 that the railway networks, the global Empire Sea communications, that his steam condenser invention would lead to 100 years later. So this is one of those slow revolutions. I mean, it appears rather fast to us, but when you look at it in 100 years' time, succeeding generations will look back and they will say, this is one of those revolutions for humankind, like the development of cereal growing, domestication of animals, smelting of metals, the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, and indeed living in cities, that changes fundamentally the way we live. And we are going to have to find ways of living as safely as we can in that world. Which brings me to just a word on the next category, which was sabotage. And there has been quite a lot written about this, cyber threats to our national infrastructure. Here, I think we should pause and try and define our concepts more precisely. I find, and I know this is shared by many of my colleagues in the academic world, the term cyber war highly misleading. Why should adversaries confine their attacks, and more importantly, their responses, to some so-called cyber domain, where the only thing that gets hurt are the machines. In the end, it's real people who get hurt in cyber attacks, real money that gets stolen, and really valuable intellectual property that gets pirated. So let us be careful when we talk about the ability in the digital world to plant Trojans, to sabotage infrastructure, and so on, that we should not expect such activity to be confined, and its response to it, only to the digital domain, which is why I emphasize all the domains of warfare. Now, we know the attribution problem, and some of you, I'm sure, will ask questions about that. If you want to invoke international sanctions against bad behavior, you've got to have a reasonably solid case as to who was responsible, and we know how difficult that is in the digital realm. Personally, and I throw this idea out for others to develop, I wouldn't rule out there being a deterrent effect for potential adversaries in knowing that whatever capabilities for e-espionage or e-attack, including, for example, Trojans to be planted, to be activated in a crisis, whatever capabilities they might contemplate are also capabilities that we and friendly allied nations have at our disposal. It's not quite the stability of nuclear deterrence, more of a Mexican standoff, as all sides recognize the dangers, and I think they should recognize the dangers, to strategic stability in a crisis, a real crisis, of being discovered to have engaged in strategic cyber sabotage. Final point under this heading, in preventing the potential for sabotage, my old colleagues in the Ministry of Defense have a conflict between the current fashion for buying things off the cheapest shelf rather than spending the money to get computer code written that is genuinely secure. Many cyber attacks, we know, exploit flaws in software, and in future will exploit flaws, embedded flaws in the software, in hardware, that need not have been there, especially if the system has been bodged together using blocks of pre-existing code written goodness knows where. And this is going to be true not just of defense, but of all the owners and operators of the critical national infrastructure. So there's some hard choices are going to have to be faced. You could argue that, well, more effective international and national law enforcement will be one way of tackling this. Certainly, I think the sort of measures which are in the government's cyber strategy are all extremely sensible. You're trying to raise the price of entry for new entrants to the criminal market, trying to put obstacles in the way of their acquiring the necessary cyber tools, and to take the most persistent offenders out of circulation. More and more countries, I know, India and Brazil most recently, are adhering to the Budapest Convention and so on, and that's where the follow-up to the Lancaster House Cybersecurity Conference takes place in October. So there is a big agenda there. It's for those concerned in intelligence, law enforcement, and justice, all trying to build up rather better international cooperation. The problem is it's all going to take a very long time. And if you think about, say, the history of the Law of the Sea conferences, these things do take a very long time. A final thought. I'm out of time, so I'll just give you one final thought, which is we mustn't really be intimidated by fears of this future. I was quite struck by a recent study that Ross Anderson at Cambridge led, which was commissioned by the Ministry of Defense, to try and estimate the cost of cybercrime globally and in the UK. And what their work was much, much more solidly grounded than the earlier estimates were done. I think that Detica, which came out with many, many tens of billions. much of cybercrime, they note, is really old crime committed through new means, such as fraud or forgery. And you can argue these new crimes are easier in principle to commit. But once we get ourselves organized, they're also going to be easier to detect in a hyper-connected world once we get the hang of it. And after all, we have the banking emails to prove the LIBOR rate was being fixed. With that, I will stop.
Well, I mean, it's always very difficult to follow someone like that. You know, I mean, a lot of the great artists and musicians, I mean, when their followers came up after them, they said, well, it's all been done, so what can I say? And they usually then degenerate into a load of abstract statements, which is probably what I'm going to try to avoid. Oh, by the way, I think the world record for overestimating the cost to the global economy of cybercrime goes to our current Foreign Secretary, who estimated it last year at $1 trillion. We don't quite know where he got it from. We're interested in talking to him about it, but I'll just throw it out to you. It's supposed to be a jokey evening, so well above the 27 billion that the UK is supposed to use according to Detica. Anyway, but I think David Omand has been very comprehensive in his remarks. I just want to do three things, really. Firstly, to reinforce some of the points he made, if only to show that somebody who is now a sort of amateur businessman, having left government 7 years ago, sort of shares the same view as David, who's been involved in the governmental space for longer, or more recently. Secondly, to sort of illustrate what one company does, just as a practical example of what actually happens these days. And I immediately apologize straight away to Hewlett-Packard, because I won't be doing them. I'll be doing my own company, the one I work with most at the moment, which is Finmeccanica. But it could be Lockheed Martin, it could be Detica, it could be Northrop Grumman. It's just an illustration, and since I know it, I know it's accurate. And thirdly, to illustrate some of the challenges that exist within the sort of commercial space to making the progress that David predicts as we master the subject. So first, I think to make the first point, as David says, these threats are really serious, but they take place within a sort of revolutionary change in the way society itself operates, how we live our lives, that is not only sort of beneficial to us economically, socially, and politically, but it's not something actually that's in the gift of governments to change anyway. They do not own the environment within which these digital transactions of all kinds are now happening. So this is not like, you know, the defense sphere or the military sphere, so that when people start talking about attack and the creation of a cyber command, I mean, this can lead to a misleading misunderstanding of what we're really talking about. Is everything we do, essentially, now in a digital space, where it can be used for ill by criminals, or it can be managed well, as in everything else. So the way ahead is essentially how to ensure that we can build confidence, as David says, in the cyber realm, so that everyday life can continue routinely and with confidence. And in fact, it's interesting that I notice the government goes further than that. This is an ambitious government that we have, and if you read the cybersecurity strategy last November, you find it says that the cyber realm is a sort of driver of economic growth and commercial success. The risks need to be managed, and I sort of take this up because it's a quote worth remembering. That quote promotes the UK as a good place to do business online and fosters opportunities for UK cybersecurity firms to leverage strength at home to sell their products overseas. So the government sees this as a sort of positive opportunity in the overall UK growth agenda. Secondly, as David said, it's very clear that government can't do it all. It can't provide all the cybersecurity we need. Indeed, it can only provide a fraction of it, even within the public sector. Neither can it actually provide all the techniques that are needed to implement effective cyber security, notwithstanding the mystical qualities of GCHQ that both David and I were very privileged to work with. The issues themselves are basically too complex and fast-moving, by the way. I mean, this is something that's happening at a very, very rapid rate indeed, not just in terms of the nature of challenge that's coming up, but also in terms of the speed of response that is necessary. The whole world is far too interconnected and networked for this simply be done by one or even groups of governments, and we've seen how they fail in other areas, and this is no different. The threats are too pervasive, and the potentially malign individuals and actors are far too diverse for this to be done by government. It has to be done in real and active partnership with industry and indeed with the public at large. And as far as industry is concerned, that partnership needs to run across the whole of the spectrum that David identified, from protecting against the sort of basic stuff of vandalism or traditional criminal behavior that's now working through the internet, identity or monetary theft, fraud, child pornography, through to sort of the higher level espionage that he's talking about, whether it's for industrial secrets or indeed for security or military purposes, and finally to the concept of using these capabilities to sabotage military or other critical national infrastructure. And I think you all know some recent rather vivid examples of that. Put another way, industry can't just get involved in the techniques necessary for that 80% of sort of basic hygiene and sensible patches and managing passwords and that sort of thing. It also has to be engaged in that 20%, involving what David calls the intelligence space, but including these advanced persistent threats, where attacks come and they're designed to disguise their origin. They dive deep into networks. They host themselves stealthily as benign software routines. You think you've got something nice and friendly. They mask their activity often by operating only sporadically. So they don't operate like Trojans very often, but they extract key data from networks, from systems, whether data that makes the network itself vulnerable, whether it's intellectual property, or indeed whether it's designed to corrupt information on which decisions of all sorts might be taken. So industry has to be engaged in that too. Just to look at it another way, I mean, David talked about the analogy of managing the transition from the horse to the motor car. The narrative I like about cybersecurity takes the sort of concept of viruses and sustains the medical analogy. I mean, we inoculate and vaccinate the whole population against basic infections and known disease. That's the sort of basic stuff. When we go on holiday, we may need additional inoculations for particularly dangerous places. That's another level of security that needs to be put in place by, indeed, companies. And beyond that, we come to treatment for specific infections and diseases, medication, or indeed operations, or sometimes isolation. You can go right up the spectrum, and the analogy with cyber works all through. And the interesting point about this is that it is not just a question of saying, we know this is an area of the internet or cyberspace, to use a horrible phrase, where these advanced persistent threats occur, and this is the bit that's okay. It doesn't work like that. You can find very, very advanced techniques being applied to obtain information or indeed to deny information throughout all of those areas. Obviously, a hostile attack chooses something that's vital, but it could be any of these areas across the whole spectrum that is subjected to advanced threat. Let me just give you some examples of, as I say, the company I know. I mean, we've got an organization called Finmeccanica Cyber Solutions. It's been building an IT security business for about 10 years now. So this, and other companies have been the same. The Americans are well ahead in this context. Europe a bit later. The company that I chair in the UK has got 2 security operations centers. One of them in Italy, which mainly does unclassified domains. One in the UK, which is focused more on restricted networks. But that doesn't mean to say the people are sophisticated in one place and less sophisticated in another. That's just how it happens to work. We have about 3,000 customers as of today, large and small, including government agencies and critical national infrastructure providers. We have about 600 cyber specialists in a business which is growing at double-digit rates. Don't get too excited about that because it's not that fast, because the money involved, and I'll come to that, is not massive, but it is growing well. We have our own laboratories to analyze and test software and devices, to develop sort of custom capabilities to address the highest grade threats. So it's not just government that has this. The intelligence activity is also done in the private sector, although not in the sort of sense of being able to break the law. Earlier this year, for example, Finmeccanica secured the largest cyber contract in Europe that there's been, which is the NATO incident response capability, which will provide over 50 NATO commands in 28 countries with sort of best current capability to detect and respond to cyber incidents across the NATO network. Now, I mentioned that last point, not particularly to blow the trumpet of the company, but because it's a response capability. It underlines one of the big truths about cybersecurity. In other words, there is no such thing as a network that cannot be penetrated, however so-called secure NATO is supposed to be, unless you isolate that network completely from the outside world. And you can't do that if you want to have business continuity. So what you have to do is to be able to identify the unusual behavior, to rapidly isolate and contain the compromise that is going on, ideally deceiving the perpetrator in the process so he doesn't know he's already been detected. And therefore, to do that, you have to manage actively the whole network in a way which is well beyond the normal IT services and networks of today. You have to build layered defenses. You have to have an understanding of network design. You have to have what is called full packet capture to all of the gateways that the network is linked to. You have to get hold of everything that's going on. You have to record the events. You have to manage and analyze them before, during, and after detection. You have to have a full record of everything that's going on. You have to see, literally, what's happening on the networks. Only then can you actually devise the right tools, devise countermeasures, increase protection, limit damage. So this is what actually goes on in the private sector as well as what goes on in government. The amount of skills and capability you need in order to do that can only come really from vast experience and understanding of the problem space. You need really well-trained and experienced analysts and operators, which is actually why most governments can't do it, because most governments actually have a rather more limited experience and life for the people who operate these things within government. It's only really outside, in the private sector, where all of this stuff is going on all of the time, that you actually get people who have enough experience of the full range of activities and attacks to build that level of security. Now, I illustrated one company. I mean, it doesn't matter how strong an individual company's teams are, you can't possibly cope in that way. You have to leverage these capabilities across a broader community of trusted partners, which is what David wanted me to speak about. And I'm not quite sure how far I can go there, but he's talked about GCHQ's CSOC, which they have set up. And at the same time, essentially, it's operating as a hub with spokes out into industry, into clusters of companies who are trusted partners in a sort of community of interest. And those companies are throwing information over the wall, as it were, to GCHQ and having information thrown back to them so that together the whole level of understanding is built up and capabilities can be increased to protect against the threats that arise, whether it's critical national infrastructure or in other sectors. Now this is beginning really first in defense, because defense and security is the easy area to do it in, because you're dealing there with companies that are already List X companies, often personnel in there who already have the security clearances to enable these sorts of dialogue to go on. people who are used to developing the protocols between government and industry that enable this information to be managed properly. But of course, there are a number of other communities where this also needs to grow. For example, finance, power, infrastructure generally, medical. The pharmaceutical industry is obviously very vulnerable to intellectual property theft. So there's a whole group of sectors where this broad approach needs to happen with, as it were, an outreach coming from government, linking with trusted providers in the industry to overall develop a much stronger capability. Let me finally just come on to some current obstacles and challenges. The first, despite what I've said, is that there is still a lack of awareness and a lack of demand for good, high-grade cyber security. And it's interesting to know why that might be. Is it sort of apathy? Is it fatalism? Is it ignorance? I mean, it's a bit of all three. I mean, one of the difficulties in this area is, firstly, you can't feel it in the same way that you can physical security. Secondly, it's very difficult to price risk. For companies to know how much they should be investing to ensure that their security is strong. Do they invest 10% of their ICT spend, which is one of the benchmarks that's been suggested? One of the difficulties is the threat can be so pervasive that company A can invest a lot of money in this, and company B do nothing. But company A has absolutely no guarantee, because there are no guarantees in this area, that it's going to be safe. So it's very hard to price risk, and I suspect this is one of the reasons why we see the problem. But the reputational damage, if something goes wrong, as we've seen, obviously, around the world now, but when that happens, and you have 1 million customers whose records are corrupted or made vulnerable, you can see just how serious and how expensive it can be. This needs to be something that's at board level in all of the big and small companies, not an issue that is done by the IT compartment. And until that happens, until it's seen as a number one board level issue on how much to spend in safeguarding oneself against this, this isn't special pleading. Until that happens, I suspect that we will still see too many losses and too many compromises of information. And I should say again, actually at the commercial level, it's quite interesting that companies do not make money out of partnering with government to ensure that government secrets remain okay, and that the Ministry of Defence network or the GCHQ network or indeed the intelligence community is safeguarded. These are actually small activities in the big picture of things. And they tend to be very interesting and very important for reputation. Very important to say, you know, we provide this service to NATO, for example. But actually, it's only in the big market that the volume of activity is going to generate serious money. And the reason I say that is because companies don't exist as charities. They have to actually be in a business that is genuinely useful. And that is why I emphasize the importance of the message getting out to the community at large, because otherwise these things will not be developed. These patches will not happen fast enough. These measures that need to be strengthened will not be there. Second issue is about insurance. Now, it's quite an interesting subject because there is a tendency perhaps to say we're not all that keen on encouraging people to take out insurance against cybercrime, cyber theft, or possible compromise of the critical national infrastructure, because actually we want people to have such high level and high grade protection that, you know, they don't fall back on insurance when, you know, if they lose, then the losses can be disproportionately damaging and you can't insure against reputation, for example. I think that's partly true, but remember David's analogy with the motor car. Insurance, I think, does have a part to play as long as it's done correctly. And what I mean is, you can conceive of a situation where a cyber security company like the one I've been talking about works with the insurer and is employed by the insurer, so that should the insurer's insurance be called that company can move in and reduce the number of days that the client is suffering a loss, get it up working faster, get its systems cleaned out more quickly, offer resilience and possibly alternative ways of managing its data, so that, in other words, it's in their mutual interest to go forward with an underwriting, as it were, of insurance by providers of higher grade security like this. And you can have other issues as well, seminars to encourage clients to do the right thing, etc., etc. But I think insurance will actually play a part in future, more so perhaps than it has so far. But at the moment the take-up is very slight, and we still have this issue of awareness. And mainly I think because too much of this debate is about by the nerdy people or indeed securocrats, and not enough about sensible people conducting business and trying to ensure that it's done with integrity. And the third issue, I think, is this whole question of the role of government as a regulator and a mandator. We know this information insurance needs to improve, and the obvious thing is to demand mandation or enforcement of standards, whether it's by GCHQ or by another authority that exists to provide standards. For example, Lloyd's Register. I mean, I mention Lloyd's Register because actually we think of them as a shipping authority, but actually what they are is an organization that guarantees or underwrites the rules necessary for the safe transit of goods from A to B. And information is a good. And so in a sense, one can look at all sorts of alternatives for doing this sort of thing. I think it's harder than it seems at first sight, because this is a business which moves, this is a threat that moves very quickly, and as it were, good standards for today can very quickly become lazy standards for 6 weeks' time or 6 months' time. It's also a challenge for government, because if they mandate something or indeed have gold stars for companies with the kite mark to say these are very good security providers, what happens if they're called and the thing goes wrong? Or indeed, how much time can they afford to spend in authenticating various levels of service? But I think industry-led standards, which is what the government is talking about at the moment, isn't going to work. Because what you'll have is IBM or some other big company saying, don't worry about industry-led standards, ours are good, just trust us. And that isn't actually good enough for bringing the whole level of society the protection it needs. So actually, thinking about it myself, I'm quite interested in looking at those independent bodies, which are not GCHQ, but who do live in the business of setting the standards and the criteria for safety of goods, to look at some of those and see whether indeed they might perform this sort of role. I can see I've spoken for far too long, so I'll shut up, because I'm sure you'll want to ask questions about a lot of issues that David and I covered. Thanks very much.
Okay, chaps, question time. Oh, hello, yeah, okay. We've got 2 roving mics. Can you tell us your name and your organisation if relevant? Okay, questions please.
David Logan, ex-FCO. I think this is a question for David. David, you talked at one end of the spectrum, the hard end of the spectrum, as about the effect of cyber attack as being like the effect of other attack, physical attack, if you like. Could you say something about thinking on that? I mean, I was thinking, of the example of the Estonians a couple of years ago. At what point does a nation state judge that the attack on its vital interest by cyber means is no different from another sort of attack, and what steps does it take in those circumstances? Deterrence of cyber attack is presumably desirable. How do you deter cyber attack? Can you use non-cyber means? And if deterrence breaks down, what steps do you then take? I can go on. I mean, are there the same issues of preemption, which were so controversial a couple of years ago in other contexts, relevant here? I mean, in general, my question has to do with how do you relate policy in, I mean, cyber warfare. I mean, the prefix is quite unhelpful sometimes, with the rest of warfare, if you like. Thanks.
Well, the short answer is nobody knows the answers to those questions, which is why it's such an interesting policy area. That, for example, does deterrence play any part whatever in the future? I'm personally inclined to think that the word deterrence in this context is best avoided, because it's not about holding at risk vital assets, which are so vital that you can construct some kind of deterrent relationship, but sort of dissuasion, raising the price of entry, risk management, likelihood, vulnerability, initial impact, duration of disruption. How would a sensible society go about managing the risk, operating on those different categories? That, I think, is probably a more fruitful way than trying to think how could we deter, particularly given the attribution problems, really have sufficient sanction to be able to say we would deter. The one area that I think is particularly problematic is where a country decides it is going to sabotage strategic systems, nuclear systems, and things like early warning radars and so on, in order, in a major crisis, to steal an advantage. That's profoundly destabilizing. And if several countries are doing it, it's even more destabilizing. So, which is why I mentioned in my remarks that that's an area, I think, that deserves quite a lot of attention. The good news is that as things stand at the moment, my reading of for example, the Stuxnet type attack is that to do any real harm, it has to be very specialized. It has to have a large amount of prior intelligence to be able to craft your software. It has to really be quite specific to the target you're trying to attack. And that means two things. One, that the all-purpose attack, which roams around the critical infrastructure, putting all the lights out, is probably at the moment fantasy. 10 years, 15 years, well, it might not be. So one has to keep an open mind. But at the moment, I don't think we should be carried away by that kind of rhetoric. And the other is that such is the investment needed, and clearly for Stuxnet, huge investment that is needed to build something like that and test it. It's only going to be applied for the things that really are critical, which again is which brings me back to worries about the strategic systems.
I think I just add a couple of points, put my old government hat back on again. I mean, I note that the American government has actually a declaratory policy, which actually says they reserve the right to respond by whatever means are appropriate to cyber attack. They don't say any further than that, but there is a declaratory policy out there. As David said, attribution is extremely difficult. And I think you have to get very specific about what type of, you have to get context specific to actually think that you can deter explicitly against certain types of threat. But as time goes by, one hopes that behaviors will become less and less acceptable because of knowledge that other people can do it to them too. I don't mention the word China in this room, but if there is a large level of intellectual property going, as China develops much more intellectual property of its own, this could end up by being a zero-sum game. So I think there are those areas where the future may suggest that some sort of dissuasion or deterrent concepts could emerge. The one area where, and a lot of it can't be put down into the public sphere. A lot of it is in the private sphere, which makes it particularly hard. The one area I find very interesting is space. Cyber and space, separate things. In space, there is a regulatory system. You have to notify if you're going to put a satellite up and that sort of thing. And things and interferences in the sort of strategic area that David is talking about used to be almost impossible to do because you needed such huge energy levels from Earth to start interfering with satellites and all of that, which control so much that we do, that it was almost impossible, if not quite impossible, to do it. Now with a small satellite industry burgeoning, you can put things up there and they can do it very easily. Now, there is an area, it does seem to me, the regulation of how space-based systems operate in this context, where that perhaps is a gap for the development of not necessarily treaty-based, but rules of the road where they don't exist at the moment. And I think that could be quite a dangerous area. I'm not sure you can do that, or should try to do that by deterrence. It does seem there may be the opportunity to actually get some international law of the space. But I don't think that works with cyber as a whole.
Yes.
Thank you. Ian Morgan, Queen Mary. Taking the car analogy, apart from insurance, one of the things that changed the nature of the car industry was imposing liability on car manufacturers to produce good cars. Now, taking your point about incentives, we have software, hardware, and firmware, if you like, that is notoriously flaky in many circumstances and creates a vulnerability. In a previous House of Lords report, it was suggested that one great advance in improving personal internet safety was to create a liability regime on software companies which would make them produce better software. That was rejected by the government, but I'd be interested to know whether either of you think that that would actually create the incentives that you mentioned to create a secure environment.
Shall I, well, as I said in my remarks, I think aligning incentives is actually one of the major ways in which you can make some progress here. The prospect of a class action in the US against, say, well, it would have to be hardware as well as software. And there, as we all know, there are problems about, at the hardware level. But the prospect of the cost of defending yourself against a class action, claiming significant damages that occurred because of flaws in the security, loopholes in the system. I would not rule that out. And I think it is worth thinking about it, but it's going to be horrendously difficult to define. And you can imagine the number of court cases you would need to build up a library of cases when it was, as it were, negligent. Given, even motor cars, if you drive them erratically, it's the driver's problem. It's not the motor car that failed to be able to stop in an unfeasible distance when the driver drove too fast. So I think strict liability is going to be quite tricky, but I wouldn't rule it out. It is actually pretty odd that we allowed some of these developments to get as far as they have without trying to pin this sort of thing down. To expand just to give a little example from the car industry, from my time in the Home Office, which was theft of vehicles, because manufacturers simply didn't put proper locks on vehicles. Why would they? Adds cost. And they're all trying to make the cheapest vehicle in order to sell the most vehicles. And it was only when the insurance industry was brought in by governments to actually get some leverage to say you offer reductions in your premium if you have a car with a proper car alarm. And within a very few years, all the car manufacturers were selling cars as standard with electronic locks on the ignitions and so on. Thefts of vehicles have plummeted as a result. And that's a good example, I think, of aligning us incentives.
Yeah, I agree with that very much so. And linked to the insurance issue, I think one of the areas that might be developed is the idea that an insurance company will underwrite a company's systems, provided it's had a health check by its underwriting provider that says that those systems are in good order. Now, that's not just a software thing, and the problem then comes, how far can you go, at what level can you drill down to make sure that the equipment being used and the codes being used are indeed not sloppy and have adequate protection in them, and I think that's the problem. And as one knows, you can, on the face of it, have very, very fine software and very robust hardware, but there's still something going wrong somewhere in there that you might not be aware of. So it is a non-trivial issue to be able to patrol, but I agree with you, that's where it should go, and I would see that as an element worthwhile in pursuing an insurance approach.
One other thing just to throw in is that it's already the case that the Ministry of Defence is imposing conditions on defence contractors. So you can't get business with the Ministry of Defence unless you meet certain specifications. The trouble with the cyber attackers is you pick the weakest point in the chain. So as with military commanders, you look for where there are junctions between two sets of forces, boundary between two corps or divisions or whatever, and that's where you mount your attack. So you go into the subcontractor who hasn't necessarily spent all the money, and so on. But that part of it as well, which is some form of regulation. Otherwise, I think I shall be interested to see the first case come up in which a civil action is brought against a company that was carrying somebody else's intellectual property, which then got thieved.
I suspect it will be in the United States because, I mean, they're already well ahead of us anyway. You can't do business with the federal government in the US without your systems passing certain levels of quality. And we're only just starting with the MOD.
Question down the front here.
Hi, my name is Nigel White, and I guess I'm asking this question from my previous experiences working in financial services and the threats I encountered there. I was wondering whether you would take a view upon being able to classify those threats which, or the likelihood of threat from, which is purely sort of a technological remote threat, sort of classic sort of Trojan going in and cleaning out systems, as opposed to, in my experience, the vast majority of successful frauds always involve some human element, either infiltration by an insider or human social engineering of duping somebody into thinking they're doing something which they weren't. So I mean, a lot of the focus has been on sort of software security, but to what extent do you think we need to protect against the human element as well?
I mean, that's the 80%. It is about everybody who works in the organisation. It's about changing their password. It's about not letting somebody who you don't know come in and log on. It's about not letting them stick, as I think Stuxnet was done, to actually stick something into a computer, which simply shouldn't happen. So there's a total activity there, and I think you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, it has to be people. And if you followed David's analogy earlier, I mean, if you really want to mount a very sophisticated attack, you're going to need an awful lot of intelligence, and that usually is going to be involving humans to actually find out what's going on in detail. You can't just do it all electronically if you've got very specific targets you're going for. So I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's not just cybersecurity, it's about the totality of security, which is why, as I say, I think this should be a board-level issue for all companies who have reliance, which is virtually all of them, on IT systems, because it's about the way in which their whole business is vulnerable, and their staff have to be the first line of defense. And I said earlier, it's also about the public in general. And I don't know if the government ought to be doing more about raising public awareness. I mean, I feel this is an area where more can be done, and I'm not sure they're being all that creative. I think they're just beginning to, you know, the idea of when you fill in your tax return online, there may now be a thing popping up which says, oh, by the way, did you know that you're rather sloppy in this, that, or the other area? I think there is a role for government to be a bit more proactive in helping people understand.
And they are indeed using HMRC
exactly.
now as a
much more aware in that way. And I personally would like to see, of course, it's hard for the industry to say that because it sounds like special pleading, but I think, you know, it'd be much better to see a rather more active and creative public campaign about what people should simply do normally in their lives to make sure they're less vulnerable to this sort of crime.
But I'm glad you mentioned the social engineering. If I'd had a bit longer, I would have wanted to talk. The extraordinary sophistication and intelligence gathering that goes into persuading any one of us, to click on the link. Which may well involve finding out the names of your children and all the rest of it, and writing an email which is so convincing that you just have to click on it and open it up and so on, and then bang, that's it, they're in. There was a wonderful example I saw only last month, which was very carefully engineered to look like a message from the IT department of a university, and had everything you would expect, and the right kind of badly written IT jargony sort of thing, and just simply pointing out that there was a problem with the last email that had been sent, and would you mind resending, and if so, you can access it readily here, and again, bingo. And it took the best part of a week to clean out the system and get rid of that. That was probably a disgruntled student that we'd given the wrong class of degree to, but it could have been extremely serious. And this is going on all the time.
Down. Down here. In the middle. He really don't want you to ask a question, Stuart, does he?
I'll do my best, thank you. Stuart Garrick, Metropolitan Police. My question, I think, is for David, really. How far do you see law enforcement's powers being increased to deal with this? We have a crime here where you have, strangely, the victim, the suspect, and the crime scene, if you like, often in different countries, different zones around the world, and you have the servers where the data is in non-friendly countries, your suspects in non-friendly countries. Do you see a time when we are able to project to doing something about those servers offshore?
It's a very good question. I don't really know the answer to it. I certainly foresee the law enforcement having the powers necessary to detect what is going on. And that means they have to have the ability to operate in a digital space. That means, for example, in relation to communications data, they have to be able to get it from the various ISPs and providers on the internet. That will be controversial with certain with politicians, but nonetheless, I think it's absolutely essential. I can see, and it's already happening as a result of the cyber strategy, better liaison arrangements with friendly countries overseas to speed up the investigative process. Are we going to be very happy for somebody else's police service to be roaming around our private email traffic because they want to track down a crime that they think's been committed in their country? We can't ask for that unless we're prepared to be subjected to it. Just as we couldn't put British immigration officials on the French side of the channel without accepting that they would put French police officers on our side of the channel. That kind of worked, but, or it does work. That's quite tricky. Arrest warrants are highly controversial, and that too, the European arrest warrant is actually, in this context, a very good, powerful tool, but that too is controversial over its use. So this is all going to be very tricky. And I don't think there's an easy way you can just simply say, give more powers to the police. I'm not sure the prosecutors necessarily need more powers, because most of what we're talking about, and if you take the financial examples, I mean, these are crimes now. Just committed in a different way, but these are crimes now. So I'm not sure you need to invent a new class of cybercrime. I may be wrong, but I haven't heard a good case for doing that. It comes down to the point I was making, I think, about real harms. are there sort of cyber offences that take place in cyberspace? Or do we say, no, the offence takes place when somehow it's in the real world, in which case we've got quite a lot of law to apply?
Please, in the middle there. No, further up.
Charles Hocking, ex-student of Queen Mary. Just related to the policeman's question on law enforcement, you talked about extradition agreements. I'm curious as to cases where, like Gary McKinnon, where you've got very bright individuals, clearly talented hackers who, fortunately enough for the United States, wasn't actually wasn't working for any government, it wasn't malevolent, he was caught, but they're putting him in prison, or they want to put him away for 60 odd years. Shouldn't governments be actually, seeking out these people like Gary McKinnon and saying, hey, we understand you've committed a crime, but we need your skills? And this is basically, this guy is insanely intelligent at hacking systems. I mean, he got through the NSA firewalls. Now, this is supposedly the most secure, in Virginia, the most secure computer system on the planet. Now, if this guy, from his bedroom, his bedroom laptop or computers can do this, surely the government should say, hey, great, here's our resources, use them and help us.
Well, actually, the part of the government's cyber security strategy, I'm not speaking on behalf of the government, but I was intrigued at the way in which they were developing the cyber security challenge, so that actually they are going out there and, as it were, offering competitions, show what you can do. The parallel there was Bletchley Park and recruiting cryptographers just before the Second World War, where it was the Times crossword competition, and the whole series of daily crosswords getting progressively more difficult. And anyone who got through them all got offered a job. I mean, so that the mythology goes. But it's not a bad selector of a certain kind of brain. Yes, I mean, we need people like that. As far as I know, the government is desperately trying to recruit people like that. It's a slightly different question because it's related to what was said about deterrence earlier, that there's a balance here, because if you say, well, from your bedroom, all right, you got into somebody else's top secret system. I don't know whether they did or not. NSA, I'm sure, has many, many systems, some of which will be less secure than others, but I've no idea what he did. But the deterrent of, if you do this, you are quite likely to be caught, and when you're caught, life will be your life will be very, very difficult. I mean, perhaps one part of me says, well, perhaps you do have to be pretty tough with people who do this, because socially you really don't want to encourage people to do this.
That's right. By the way, I don't know if you know, there used to be an old phrase in Scotland that judges used to use when they had an offender coming up, and they say, it's Berlini, which is a prison, or the Argylls. And there perhaps, is a bit of that. I mean, I agree with David, if somebody's actually breaking the law, there's a separate point. There's an offence, and, he ought to be brought to book. We don't like the US extraterritoriality, and we don't like the way they throw 60-year sentences, huge numbers. You go to prison for several hundred years in the United States. Rather interesting way of looking at it. But on the other hand, I know for a fact that the US do recruit people like that and do tap them on the shoulder and sort of say, careful, Sonny, we think you ought to be working for us. Otherwise, you could be in deep trouble. That does happen. I would not think it happens in a country like our own, where things are much more clear, and the rule of law is much more clearly obeyed.
Yes.
John Deverill at Keyhaven. Two questions, if I may. The first one, Sir Kevin, you mentioned, or you posed the question, what price risk? Again, I'm wondering whether, in terms of the incentives, one can turn it around and look now increasingly at what investors expect companies to do. Nobody's mentioned, I don't think, the Information Commissioner's Office, and the fact that now companies are being fined up to £500,000 without it even needing to go to court for being lax with data security. And whether, joining together what was said earlier in terms of some sort of level of assurance provided by an independent body, perhaps in this case the ICO or someone else like that, which in itself would be used by investors as a basis for providing more confidence in companies in which people want to invest. And perhaps linked with that, a direct value accorded, for instance, to capital being cheaper for those companies. So whether in due course you consider that could be an incentive as opposed to playing to the sort of fear side of it. My second question is to do with, again, using the Cold War analogy. Again, I'm aware that you won't be able to give more than a sense of this as far as the answer is concerned, but to what extent perhaps a percentage of hostile cyber activity is actually purely devoted towards intelligence gathering by possibly hostile powers in order to equip themselves for the big push, whatever that might be. Thanks.
Yeah, on the first point, I mean, I think you are. I mean, it's very interesting if you feel that investors are already beginning to get there. I mean, there have been some very high-profile cases. There was a thing in the paper this week to say that one British company is supposed to have calculated a loss of up to £800 million, which I've got no idea how. That was cited by Tebbit. Yes.
Yeah.
I read it. I'd be very interested to know who it was and how they calculated it. But I mean, it just goes to show maybe there is a groundswell of awareness coming. And I think it would be very helpful if investors did take the view that, you know, they don't want to be backing companies who could be in serious reputational trouble if they're not much more careful with the information they hold. I don't think that's happened yet. I haven't seen that occurring yet in terms of the pressures on companies. There's enough pressures on them at the moment in all sorts of directions. But that's not one I've seen yet. But if we have many more losses like that, and we've seen several now, I suspect that will grow. Certainly, I think the insurance thing, that's only just starting. I mean, talk about Finmechanica Cyber Solutions. We have now signed an agreement with a company called Chartis, which I think used to be, I've forgotten what it used to be called, Axe or something. Anyway, it's a big one. And I think so far we've got about 3 or 4 people who've signed up. We're looking for 30, 40, 300, 400. But this is where that particular area is at the moment. Other IT companies, security companies may have done better than that, but I think they're fairly early on in that game of trying to get it backed with insurance. Once you get that, you can begin to build in these incentives that David was talking about, because you can offer various ways of reducing premium according to the way people behave in terms of their business. And I think that will be useful. I don't know how far you can go. I mean, one can construct all sorts of scenarios, but I think the general principle that it is better to try to achieve good cybersecurity through incentives, financial incentives, business-related activity, rather than the heavy hand of regulation or securocrat language about risks to this or that and the other, I think is much better, and probably the way in which these things will probably go in the end. I recall when David and I were both in government, it was very difficult to get other departments to implement good security measures, generally. If it was the Ministry of Defence or the Home Office or the intelligence agencies that told them they should, they only started doing it when it was really clearly affecting their business. And it was a business interest that they should be following in order to have greater protection. And that was for government departments, how much more so for the economy in general. Remind me of your second question?
It was to do with, again, using the Cold War as an analogy, and I know it's quite important to say, what percentage of hostile or potentially hostile power efforts in cyberspace might be geared towards gaining intelligence and big push rather than to actually doing anything as such at the moment? Hypothetical question, I would have thought the answer was yes, but whether or not people have their eyes on that as well.
How can you measure it? I mean, I suspect 80% of what goes on at the moment is crime, just straightforward crime, in terms of what we detect as trouble in cyberspace, as it were. And it is a much smaller figure that is regarded as sort of intelligence gathering or malicious activity in that sense. Impossible to say, but that's exactly what some of these tools would facilitate. In other words, the idea of putting Trojans into systems sitting very, very deep is to be prepared perhaps to do something at a later stage. I mean, we don't want to go into too much detail here, but we've already seen the way a state has used this type of attack as a precursor to actually military intervention. I don't say that will be a general principle, and I imagine that was a very special set of circumstances, but it could happen. At the moment, I very much doubt that that's a real issue. I suspect that's slightly in the realm of science fiction, but you know, once you've got that capability, then it could be used to simply suck information in a neutral way for a long time.
I mean, so far, as far as I'm aware, if you take the 20%, the advanced persistent threats, that is more driven by gathering intelligence on activity which has some commercial value, either in relation to contract negotiations which are taking place, see the backs of the other guy's cards, or in terms of intellectual property theft, whether it's defense, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, extractive industries. These are all sort of areas where this kind of penetration by one or more nations is rife. There's a real paradox there for companies, I think, and for government agencies, because the great advantage of the medium is it is so easy to connect, and therefore you have innovation, you can bring many minds to bear on a problem, you can share information, you can share work in progress, hugely more efficient than the old ways of doing things. But actually, if you have the crown jewels in the form of your pharmaceutical research findings that you've spent, you know, tens or hundreds of millions of pounds on already, the only answer is you must never, ever, ever put this on a network that's, you know, accessible by almost anyone. And, you know, that is very difficult.
You know, the true story of one of our big accountancy firms, I can't remember which one, so I can't tell you which one. One of the big five was doing a study for the BBC, and they got to a stage where they said to the BBC, tell us what is the most important information, what are your crown jewels, because you need to take them offline and keep them separate, because your systems are sufficiently interconnected as for them to be totally vulnerable. And they were expecting a reply which sort of said something Reithian, you know, like the BBC World Service or that sort of stuff. But what they were told was actually it's the future programs for EastEnders.
Now, we are at time up, but and I swear this is not a setup. We have a Myling group first. We have our first question, cyber question, actually. John? No, over to you, my friend. It's not. It's come through.
I promise you this isn't a setup. This is from Tom Williams, who is a parliamentary researcher for Andrew Gwynn, and he wants to know what the panel make of the notion that cyber war isn't real and not war in the way that Clausewitz and others defined it.
I think I've already answered that question. The point here is the argument that's raging in the academic community about whether you can have, quote, cyber war. In other words, a conflict within the confines of cyberspace, as against what I was arguing, that all forms of warfare, land, sea, and space, will in future have some kind of cyber dimension. So I think the idea that states, perhaps in order to minimize casualties, perhaps in order to dodge questions of attribution, will be having a go at each other in cyberspace, I find, frankly, slightly far-fetched. But I could be terribly, terribly wrong.
No, I agree with you entirely. I mean, as I said myself, you know, the idea there is land, sea, air, and cyber, and you can have a cyber command that looks after cyber, is a complete misunderstanding and misrepresentation of the reality, because cyber, as it were, is everything we do. It pervades all of our activities. And therefore, to try to single it out and say you can have a cyber war seems to be naive. The only area where I find it quite interesting is actually in space. And I do find the idea of the use of space weaponry within space, which can actually damage and knock out facilities which are actually vital for our digital activities on Earth. I find that quite intriguing and rather worrying, and I'm quite keen on work which probably needs to be done in exploring whether there are international rules of the road that can apply in space, because I think a space-based, knocking out satellite communications, which are used for all sorts of things, could be extremely worrying. But
the other
with
thing
that
is,
small exception, I don't see.
The other thing is just to keep
cyber warfare as
this
such.
in proportion. As we speak, there are 1.5 million people on the east coast of America that don't have electricity. Natural causes.
Well, on that bombshell, we bring to an end the final Mile End group.
Electromagnetic pulses.
We bring to an end the final Mile End group of the season. The first one back on the 27th of September, we'll see Sir Nigel Sheinwald talk about what the 2012 US election will mean for the UK. You'll be very welcome to that. Only left for me to say, please join us for a drink and join me in thanking our guests.